This talk is kind of fun because it goes over two really large systems that I worked with over the course of my career. I've worked with the company I'm at for almost 10 years now, and basically all we do is just build custom systems for our customers. And I have the opportunity every now and then to work on really large projects and large clients. And so this talk is really an experience report on two large projects that I worked with. One that got started at about 2007, 2008, so really when DDD was like really starting to come in, but before the whole event sourcing thing that kind of screwed everything up. So right before, it was like the golden days of entities and aggregates and junk, and repositories, all those things. And so it started around that time. And then about 3 or 4 years later, I had the opportunity to do another project for almost the exact same client and almost the exact same domain. Still a different project, wasn't a rewrite or anything like that. The first one actually did ship. So, but what it is was what I want to talk about was all the lessons we learned from the first project, things we did wrong, and all the things we applied from doing domain-driven design on a large project and applied it to the second project. So first, I want to talk about the first project we worked on, the Majestic Monolith. Has anyone heard this term before? A few of you. You should, if anyone here is familiar with the microservices, a lot of what microservices talks about is what it's not. And one of the things microservices says it's not is this monolith thing. Well, the people in the Rails community didn't like how they were being pointed at and said, you're building this nasty big thing. And so one of the leaders of the community said, no, actually, it's this glorious place, this majestic monolith where everything is in one place and one project, one application, and everything works just so beautifully. Just one more annotation, and then everything will work just great. But it turns out the first project I did with DDD was one of these things, unfortunately. So I want to talk through some of those lessons learned. First, I want to get a little bit of the project background of this system. This system was for the state of Texas. We were building a system to deal with kids that got in trouble in the state of Texas. Now, if you don't know, anyone here that got in trouble when they're younger? I certainly didn't, of course not. There are different legal paths for you as a kid versus an adult. And so what this project was about was dealing with the kid side of things. And the major people we're dealing with was the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, which sounds very foreboding and imposing, but they really were really concerned about the kids. Their whole reason for existence was to make sure that kids, when they got in trouble, didn't continue to get in trouble and try to put them on the path to not being an adult offender. Now, we were not the first company to be involved with this project. There was a company that came before us. And like a lot of the projects that we work with, usually comes after there was some large failure. And the failure that came before us was a failure of trying to do everything in a big waterfall manner. So the previous company spent an entire year building requirements documents. The requirements documents, if you printed them out, were about this big or so. It was about 1,000 pages or so of requirements documents that was built up over the entire year. But there's actually no software built from this project. So that's where we came in. We were going to be the very first Agile project for the state of Texas, which had the unfortunate side effect that Agile sprints and Scrum was actually written into our contract, which wasn't a good thing when you wanted to move away from it. And it was also the very first domain-driven design project for the state of Texas. So there's a lot of firsts, not only for ourselves as a company, but for the state of Texas working with government agencies. Now, I know what you're thinking, like government agencies, they're very fast and nimble. They know how to move quickly and deliver software well. So this should be pretty easy for them. But I want to dispel that notion for you right now. So one of the things we're trying to do was replace a bunch of existing projects and previous systems, that is. So if you look at the landscape before the system we built, there are a number of systems that actually existed. The first one was a system that big cities had. So typically, big cities in the state of Texas had their own IT budgets, their own IT departments. And so they would build their own systems to deal with this. So all the big cities in the state of Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, those all had very big, well-defined systems with various ages as well. So Houston, for example, had a system that was about 30 years old, lots of function keys, and the screen was quite green. And served them well for about 20 of those years, but after a while, no longer really served them well. And so all the big cities had their own, but there are all the other cities in the state of Texas, of which there are many. So all the other cities, besides the big ones, had just one system that was provided for them by the state of Texas. And I think the system was Microsoft Access based. So it was really scaled well and handled lots of users at once. And so we had the general idea is that we take all these different systems that people have built up over the years and replace them with one system that everyone would use. And of course, it's government, so we have to have an acronym. So it's going to be the Juvenile Case Management System, or JCMS. We had a number of project goals associated with this. It wasn't just build one system that would replace everyone else's system. They wanted to fix some fundamental design issues and fundamental process issues with the previous systems. Now, in the previous picture, where I had everyone building their own individual systems, there were no times when systems would talk to each other or people would talk to each other. And this had a real human impact as well. So, by the way, they had very depressing stories, so I won't tell the very depressing ones, just like the not so depressing ones, dealing with kids in trouble. So one example we'd have would be like a kid gets in trouble in Fort Worth. Fort Worth is a city that's very close to Dallas, but they have two different systems. So sometimes a kid would get in trouble over here and then go and move in with their aunt or uncle in Dallas. They'd get in trouble over there, and then that other system would have no idea the history or background of what happened previously. So they would know that, oh, this kind of program didn't work well for them, but they responded well to this, or don't send them to this relative because they had problems with that relative. And I'll stop there because, again, things get downhill very quickly in this sort of domain. So the idea was to build this one system where we could have, everyone could know about everything that was going on with the entire process of this kid. So some of the goals: one, increase knowledge sharing to make sure that people from across different counties would have the history and knowledge of what was going on with this kid to better serve them and make sure they went onto the right path. We wanted to make sure, too, that we had a single system responsible for covering all aspects of the juvenile process. So each of the previous boxes I showed before was not actually one box. It was between 5 and probably 20 systems, depending on each individual county. And so all the counties had just put all this money into a giant sack and said, right, we're only going to do this once. Let's just build one system to do absolutely everything. And everyone thought that was a fantastic idea. Oops. We also want to provide a very complete picture of the juvenile from start to finish. So be able to know over time what they've done, what has worked well with them, what hasn't worked well, and be able to, for the people trying to help the kid to have all the information they needed to be able to help the kid as best as possible. So a lot of very noble goals. So is anyone here familiar with the kind of legal process of the United States? This is what it looks like. It's super complicated, actually, it turns out. It's almost as if like lawyers and politicians wrote it. It's really crazy. And in fact, what we were going to be doing here was not actually the top part here. This top part is the adult side of things. If they find out you're a kid, you go down to this bottom track. And so the system we're going to be building was going to be that bottom track of everything that go on with the juvenile. And so I think I see, like 5 or 6 different colors there. So that's 5 or 6 different government agencies that deal with a kid. But in reality, there's sub-agencies and sub-agencies. So there wind up being about 20 or 30 actual government agencies that would be using this one single system. Now, when you're getting started with a new Agile project, first sprint, iteration 0, you have to code something. Well, you need to know what you're going to code. So what do you write in order to know what to code? Anyone? User stories. We needed user stories, but user stories have to have some user persona in mind. So we had this exercise where we wrote out all the different personas for all the people in that bottom bracket there. And so it started out kind of simple. Oh, that box got messed up. So first we started with Matt, the mental health practitioner. And then went to Pete, the probation officer. You can tell they're kind of cute like this. Larry, the law enforcement officer. Nancy, the nurse. Judy, the judge, obviously. And it kind of went, it went more and more, until finally we got to the end with Patty, the probation officer with disposition privileges. That was the toughest one to remember. Actually, that wasn't even close. We actually had way more personas. We wound up having 72 of these. Now, these are boxes, but we actually bought those really big 3M Post-it notes and put them on the wall. We put them on one wall, like these little, like a pillar like this, but that pillar obviously got way too crowded. So we moved them eventually to a wall more like this side that had all the personas up there. But we noticed there was a problem. We couldn't tell who was who. So we wound up actually color coding the different Post-it notes. So we had different colors for different government agencies so we could actually understand like what are the different functional areas and the different groups of people in the system. So that was our very first lesson here, was that we were reading the domain-driven design book. We basically stopped at the part that Eric Evans said you should really start, the bounded context part. We stopped before we got there. And so we're going to say we're just going to build one system for absolutely everyone. Now the screenshot I have here is all the menu items relating to a specific juvenile. This is actually the application. Now every single one of those menu items is basically another government agency that has their own set of rules and regulations dealing with this kid. And this software has everything of all those different things in this, just around this one single kid. Now, of course, I'm logged in as an admin, so you can see everything. So if you're only like Bob, the behavioral health person, you only see that one menu item. But it absolutely had everything to do with the kid in this one single application. Now, there was, we could say that, okay, we should have built things in bounded context, but that would have been really difficult given the current goals of the system. They really want to have that one single view of the juvenile, and the only way they knew how to do that was to have one single transactional system that did absolutely everything. And so to try to walk them back away from that decision would have probably taken 6 months and derailed the entire project. We knew this was going to be a problem, but we just could not contractually do anything about it, unfortunately. So contracts, those are also a thing to worry about as well, no matter what your project. The next big thing we had was if we're dealing with a system that has to talk to all those different bounded contexts, it was very difficult for people to agree on kind of the core fundamental concepts of that system. And so we'd have things like person. Does anyone have a table called person in their system? And person does everything, right? But what is a person? Well, I'm a person. You are people. But what is that in the concept of this system? Nothing, really. It means everything. It has the superset of every single possible attribute to everything that could possibly happen to a person. And this had very negative side effects. So let's suppose that a kid gets in trouble. So they get put into the system. Well, a kid is a person, so they're a person in our system, but they're flagged as a juvenile. Well, let's say that the juvenile probation department does their job. They get the kid the right counseling they need, the correct school system they need, getting the scholarships they need. So he goes on and goes to school, becomes a lawyer, and he says, you know what? I was so glad with those services being done, so I want to become a lawyer that helps kids in trouble as well. So they go to law school, come out, start to help kids. In their very first case, they go to use this system, but it says they already exist in the system as a juvenile. And so they can't actually use the system because they can't be both a lawyer and a juvenile. That's crazy. A kid can't be a lawyer. That doesn't make any sense. So just us building these fundamental concepts, not realizing that a person can be one thing in real life, but in terms of the concept in the system, it can't mean the exact same thing. That really hamstrung us to build these sort of things in the future. I wish I could say we fixed this modeling, but we just wound up adding even more attributes to be this, like, you could be multiple things at once. And what are you on a certain day of the week? You were used to be a juvenile up until this point, and then now you became something else. So we had very time-based attributes in our system. It was really ugly. So that was the next big lesson we had was if we're building a ubiquitous language, that ubiquitous language should actually be ubiquitous amongst everyone that uses it. When we talked to the different people using the system, no one ever used the word person. They used very domain-specific names. They used juvenile. They used, I guess the cop said perp or whatever, like cop-specific thing they would call it. But at no point did anyone ever say person. But that was the only common thing we could think of that represented all these different things, person. So that was our next big lesson, that if we're building a ubiquitous language, everyone should actually use those terms. We also had some very bad competing priorities. When you try to build a system to satisfy everyone, it's really going to satisfy no one. So we had 4 major agencies dealing with the system. We had the law enforcement agency, so police. We had the prosecution department, who was there mainly to prosecute kids. The court system, which is just there as the legal framework. And then finally, the actual last part, the juvenile probation department, these were actually the people that hired us and were the product owners of the system. So the system for them was awesome, because every story was written in their perspective. It satisfied all the requirements, but everything else was more or less an afterthought because they weren't experts in that part of the area. So we went to each different group and said, okay, what is the most important thing that you need to worry about? What is the thing that you deal with number one on a daily basis? And let's make sure the system is tailored to those needs. So we went to the law enforcement agency. They said, right, for us, It's the offense, the thing you did wrong, and us catching you for it and arresting you for it. This is what we do on a daily basis. We go out and we catch offenders and we arrest them. And we file lots and lots of paperwork about those two things. Courts are all about the trial. They gather these different offenses and arrests together into a single case. They deal with the legal framework of adjudicating, and then there's some sort of outcome or disposition of the trial. And the prosecution department is all about the case. They try cases. In fact, when you go visit them, they have a stack of cases. Everyone's watched Law & Order, right? There's like always this big old stack of cases on their desk. That's what they'll deal with on a daily basis. And then finally, JPD, for them, it really was all about the kids. They were the ones that the system was built for, and for them, like it was the juvenile case management system. So really, the focus and priority was really on them, not anyone else. So our next big lesson was a core domain needs consensus. Everyone needs to agree about what the most fundamental building blocks should be, the fundamental focus of the system. If we have very different core domains, then that doesn't mean you have one core domain. You have many core domains that should be separated out. But we didn't have that consensus, so we had a lot of friction even when we had something called the same thing between different places. We had a lot of friction there. And that friction became very evident when we had to deal with something that was sort of fundamental to the system. The way a juvenile gets entered in the system is they commit some sort of offense. That's how they get entered in the system. And so we said, okay, right, this is a fundamental thing, an offense. Everyone can agree about what this means, right? Right? No. So we went to every single agency again, this is 4, but there were like 20, and said, okay, what is an offense to you? What does that mean? Because we could say that, that term is meaning. It's not ambiguous. It's not like person that doesn't mean anything to anyone. Offense means something to everyone. So let's find out what that something means. Well, for the law enforcement agency, an offense was a form they filled out. Form CR-23J, that's literally the one they have to fill out. It's filled out in triplicate because they have to have different copies going to different people, which should have been an indication that like real life messaging, maybe we should have messaging in our system in different bounded contexts, but hindsight. And so that's really what the offense and arrest was for them. It's a thing to fill out and then report on. The courts for them, an offense was something to adjudicate, something to get some kind of outcome of and walk it through the process in a legally correct fashion. In the prosecution department, this is something they wanted to charge for. Like prosecution doesn't care about whether the kid goes in the right path or not. They get offenses, they charge for them. That's what they do. And then finally, for the JPD, an offense is something to move past. You need to get past this offense, get good again, get on the right side of the law, and move past. So that was the next lesson, that I need to have consensus about what something means across all the different people there. If I don't have agreement, if there's no common definition between all the different groups, then there's no way I can build a system to satisfy all those different needs. Now, there are cases where I don't have agreement about a word, but that's just because no one has actually got together in a room and tried to define something. So I do find this on myself doing this on projects quite a bit, where someone will say a word A, someone will say a word B, but they didn't really mean B. They really meant A. And so I'll correct them and they'll say, oh yes, I really meant A. And I'll try to get the domain experts to all be using the same terms because they really have the same meaning. They're just mixing up the terms themselves. But if I actually drill down into the meanings behind the terms and they mean totally different things, then there's no way I can build a successful system for each of those different constituents. Now this was 2007, right? So we were all reading, we all read the DDD book back then, and then we also read the Applying DDD book by Jimmy Nilsson, right? That book. And so that book describes a lot of the code structures. And so we follow those code structures somewhat religiously. There were example projects out there as well that we go ahead and pulled from. And in fact, this is about when the Spring framework in Java kind of switched its path and made itself into a very structured format based on these DDD principles. Now, before I did DDD, I did things totally different and incorrectly in this in-tier architecture, right? Where I had a UI layer, a business logic layer, a data access layer, and finally the database. Now, we totally fixed this when we went to domain-oriented design by moving to the DDD in-tier style, where I had domain objects in a repository as opposed to the business logic layer and the data access layer. Now, we took this to its logical conclusion we went through all the patterns and said, right, this one pattern doesn't quite meet all of our needs, so we have to extend it past that. So we wind up with something like this. And I wrote this, by the way, so I have no one to blame but myself. I did get blame actually on it, so yes, it was me. This is an example of one of the repository classes. If you can't see it in the back, it's because it's way too much stuff going on, and it's unintentional. Actually, you can't even see the end of it because I can only fit so much before it started getting too small for the ping to render correctly, but it goes down to like down here somewhere, I think, the rest of this. This is a repository. This repository is our offense repository. Offense is a very important concept to our system, so it has a lot of stuff going on as part of it. Now, at the time, there were two competing patterns for repositories going on there. There were entity or aggregate-specific repositories. So I'd have I aggregate repository. So in this case, I have I offense repository. And then the other side that said you shouldn't build specific repositories, you should build generic repositories. So these are repositories that aren't specific to any one individual aggregate or domain object. They're more generic, and they're really just meant there to be an abstraction or encapsulation over your data access. So that way, in the future, if you wanted to switch out your ORM, because we do that all the time, right? You could by just swapping out the repository implementation, and it's just that easy. Well, we did both. This offense repository implements iRepository of offense, which is kind of a mind something. Because that's what you do. I can say that we took this to we did both. We did the generic and the specific. We took both to their logical extreme, and then a few years ago, Eric Evans did a follow-up presentation that said how I would have done DDD 10 years later. And one of the things he said was something along the lines of all those structural patterns at the beginning, he would have put it as an appendix at the end, saying the really important part was bounded context, the part we didn't quite get to because we'd already read so much and it was getting late and we needed to build something. And I could say, that was part of our fault, but also it was part of the general DDD community. Everyone was really focused on the structural aspects of these patterns as opposed to the design thinking and the boundary shaping that is most important. So that was our fifth lesson here, is that all those structural patterns actually didn't contribute to the success of the project one way or the other. We argued endlessly, bike shedding, over what is the best aggregate pattern to use. Oh, we got domain events, so we got to do this kind of domain and event pattern. What are value objects? We should have a base value. We argued endlessly over those, bike shedding, but they were by far the least important part of domain-driven design. As a core layer as well, layers are for cakes, not for systems. Eating layered cakes, although I wouldn't do it all at once, as I saw recently. But the layers are not for architectures, they're for cakes. So, final tally of our Majestic monolith. This was a MVC MVC web-based application. So as part of this, we had 195 controllers. This is, by the way, these aren't accomplishments. These are just measurements. 652 actions, 121 roles or personas, 218 entities, 184 value objects, 352 enumerations. By the way, does anyone have anyone bigger than this? More than, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. By the way, remember that color-coded picture? You probably have one of those as your database schema diagram, right? Plotted out on some expensive plotter where you've color-coded diagrams of different tables. That was what we did 20 years ago. We just replaced that with color-coded entity and aggregates now. But I will say at the end of this, it did go to production. We did deploy it. It took us longer than I would have thought. It took about 18 months for the first deployment. Because it had to do everything. We had to replace every single system at once for our counties. But at this point, it is about 50 counties deployed in the state of Texas. So although it was a monolithic application that is still not so easy to change today, it was successful in that we shipped. And it is providing value to the people of the state of Texas. So this is the myth that we were shown. This Majestic monolith where everything is just connected beautifully and everything's so clean and perfect, but it's really like District 9 where it's really like a shabby mess of duct tape and baling wire, things not quite working together at all. So that was part one. Part two was our do-over. I thought my life was done in legal systems in the state of Texas, but it wasn't. Coming hot off the heels of the juvenile case management system was going to be the adult case management system. And so that happened. There was an adult case management system that tried to build the exact same kind of thing we did in the juvenile side. We weren't involved anymore because they thought they could do it better by themselves, so they tried. And they spent about 3/4 of the money, and it failed, and then we got a call. And this is our do-over. So some of the background here, it was going to be, at this point, too costly and expensive to build that one single entire system. We didn't want to do that anyway, but at this point, the money had almost run out, and so they only had enough money for one thing, one agency as part of the whole. And so at this point, we'd only just focus on one single agency at a time, get those agencies deployed, get them using our system, and then move on to the next one. And this time, we would start with prosecution. Prosecution is dealing with this blue area here. It looks really complicated, but that's just because of the artifact of the drawing here. In terms of prosecution itself, it's really just dealing with cases and cases moving through the system and going to trial and having an outcome. But otherwise, it's just really a lot of like business processes and workflows of dealing with that. As well as some rules around just different legal things that you have to worry about and legal procedures. But otherwise, it was just that blue part we have there in the middle. So still a large box, but not like the gargantuan entire box we had to try to do before. This new system was going to be built around bounded contexts. So we're going to build a system that was just dealing with prosecution. And when we were able to just talk to the prosecution folks, they were able to tell us, like, we were able to build the items around the core things that mattered to them the most. For example, we were actually able to build our system around cases, around other things that matter to them, like dockets, which I learned what that word was going through here. A grand jury, the grand jury process of deciding whether a case needs to go to trial. And an important concept that doesn't exist in the legal framework, but existed in all the different counties, was the workflow in which they processed cases in each of their departments. We'd build a wall around this, and we're going to make them pay. No, never mind. No. I can't say anything. Texas voted for the guy. God. I'm in Austin, though. We're totally different. Certain things are still legal there, though. So. And then everyone else that had to deal with the prosecution department, which we saw them in real life. We went to go visit the agencies, and we'd see people coming in that clearly weren't lawyers because they weren't in a suit. And we'd say, who's that? Oh, that's this person. They're coming here to do blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you actually have a real life anti-corruption layer between you and them. You actually have a real life boundary that they have to come open your door and give you documents, and then they leave. So law enforcement agency was one of those. We had the defense attorneys as well. And a couple others as well, courts and indigent defense, which is if you can't afford a lawyer, that's them as well. So we'd build a prosecution system, and then as we learn about what other people and what other systems we need to talk to, we would design those interactions based on those individual use cases and figure out exactly what we needed for each of those. But the core part of our system, we would keep pure and wholly focused on prosecution. This is an actual quote when I went to one of the prosecutors of our system and said, hey, we're going to build you a prosecution system. Don't you love our JCMS system? And this was their quote, they told me, which was something you never want to hear for a system you built over 2 years and are super proud of, is someone calling a piece of crap. But that was the truth. If you remember back to who were the product owners and who actually purchased the original system, those are the probation officers. And they were basically at direct opposite odds with the prosecutors. Prosecutors want to prosecute the kids. Probation officers don't. And so there's this natural friction back and forth where prosecutors see all the bad of what's happened. I mean, like they're very bad things kids do sometimes. And sometimes you can't just like not do anything about it. So we have to balance those two things. And so we can't build a system to satisfy both those requirements. So when we get to the prosecution department and we built a system for their like mortal enemies, well, of course they aren't going to like that system. So instead what we do is we built a very case-centric system. So when you log in and you view things, you're actually viewing cases, not people, not defendants, not juveniles, nothing like that. It's cases. When we go visited their departments, the thing they dealt with on a daily basis was not defendants or offenses or arrests. It was the things that bound those pieces together into a single legal process, and that was a case. So in this case, it looks like I got into some trouble. I got in trouble and I burgled a rail car, evidently. By the way, you have to be very careful of these with sample and dummy data. Sometimes I would have things like Bart Simpson murdered Lisa and did something to Marge, and then they would remember a time that actually happened and start to get upset. I'm like, okay, we'll just stick with like stole gum or something like that. So got to be careful of sample data in systems like this. So what we saw is when we focused wholly on the things that mattered most to them, it brought us into this entirely new set of avenues of building software and experiences for them that were impossible before. In the previous system, there were a couple of those sections that were really well thought out and well designed, but everything else was strictly CRUD-based. It was edit this, add this, do the other thing. But with this one, we were able to build a system around what they were actually doing and what mattered to them most on a daily basis. And so that was our first lesson here, that when we have a very cohesive system, we can expand on that and build an even better system than we could before, because that cohesiveness brought better clarity into what they were doing and deeper insight into the domain. This even got down into the way we built roles and security. In the previous system, we built hard-coded all those user personas actually went into roles in the system. In the new system, we modeled that differently in that we built dynamic users, dynamic roles, but the actual permissions, the things you could do in the system, those were the things that were hard-coded in the system. And we hard-coded them, basically a big list of things you can do in our code itself. And one of the problems I have with systems that I see sometimes pulled off the shelf is that they're the infinitely configurable, infinitely dynamic system. You could add anything to anywhere, but there's no business logic you could build around that. Instead, that business logic is built into other configurable screens. With our system, we were able to put a stake in the ground and said, you know what? There's only so many things a user can do in this system, so we're going to build explicit permissions around those tasks associated with the systems. And then we're able to do things like tag individual actions. This is C#, I'm sorry, there's lots of curly braces and junk. We're able to tag individual actions in the system to those specific permissions in one single spot, so that if I wanted to disallow someone from doing something, that action, that intent was actually only recorded in one place in the action that the code did it. And so I can look in that code through various means to say, okay, if they don't have permission to do this thing, don't show the link, don't show the section, don't show the button, but the actual representation, that concept, is going to be in one spot. That wasn't possible in the previous system that was both too dynamic in some places and too static in others. So those are our next lesson is when we're building systems for a large group of people, it's important to understand what needs to be flexible in some places and what needs to be rigid. If you build things too flexible, then there's no business logic associated with the system. It's all in the edges, in comment fields, in workflows. It's not actually in the actual business objects and domain objects themselves. But if once we started talking to different clients, we started to understand exactly where it should bend, where it should be different, where it should be flexible. In this case, we found that different counties had different numbers of people, so there was no need to have a rigid set of roles and groups in the system. Instead, we can leave that flexible for the counties to decide who does what and exactly how they want to group people together. But what they can do, that needs to be actually hard-coded. One of the more enlightening things that happened in this experience was talking to each individual county and going through their workflows and really trying to understand what are the most pressing needs, what are the biggest problems you face on a daily basis. And it was funny because two counties that were right next to each other, Dallas and Tarrant County, which is Fort Worth, or is Tarrant Dallas? I don't know. Dallas and Fort Worth cities, right next to each other, had actually the exact same major problem in their systems that existed today, a file management problem. So we went to Fort Worth, said, right, you said on the phone you had a file management problem. Show me your file management problem. So their file management problem was that when a case is being brought to court, they go out and try to gather as much evidence as possible. And more the evidence that you can get is going to be not physical evidence, but digital evidence. Things like videotape surveillance, things like dash cam videos when they haven't switched them off never mind. You know the problem in Texas. Just a lot of videotape and other kind of evidence that gets recorded not as a physical thing in a baggie, but as something on a thumb drive that has to still have that chain of custody, but still has to make it back to physically to the to the prosecution department. So their problem was that they had too much of it. They had yottabytes, I don't know, whatever's like terabytes after terabytes, and then after that one again is how much digital media evidence they had, because this was like raw footage they could stretch out a long time. And they had to keep this data for legally a long time. I think it was like 15 years they had to keep this evidence on file. And then after 15 years, there was another process they had to archive it after that. So they had so much of this data they had to deal with, and they had to have it physically located there, because that was another law in the state of Texas. Their problem was just that, how do we deal with all these different files? Digital files. We then went over, took the 40-mile drive east over to Dallas and said, right, we just got back from Fort Worth. They showed us their rad file management problem. Can you show me your file management problem? We're like, right, it's right this way. We walk over, and they stop at a desk, and there's like no computers, and they point up at the ceiling and show us this. A leak in the ceiling, which is dripping water on their physical files, paper files, and it's ruining them. And that's a problem because that's their only copy of that file. And if those files get destroyed, they just throw the case out. Literally, they take the case like, well, guess we lost that one. You think I'm joking, but I'm not. Now, I mean, as I was walking to where the leak was, I was starting to sense there was a different kind of file management problem, because I couldn't just walk like normally. I had to walk like this, and then like this, like that, because stacked on all sides of us in every single hallway were boxes and boxes and boxes of those physical documents that they had to keep. They used to keep them in the basement, but what happens in Texas? Floods, right? So maybe don't keep those in the basement where it can flood. So they kept them upstairs, or they just around everyone else. So their problem was like literally dealing with the physical files. And if they lost those files, which did happen, like literally did happen, the entire office would stop. And everyone would look for the file. They would go look in boxes, look in drawers, look in ceilings. Well, maybe not ceilings. They go look in their briefcases, go look at home. Everything would stop until they found this file, because basically that legal process stopped, and there was a clock that said if you don't respond X amount of time, then basically you've gone past whatever legally they're allowed to wait for, and they could be set free. There's also another problem with this, even with the people that got in trouble. Before the system was put in place here, the entire process for when someone gets arrested to someone brings charges, it's when someone brings charges that they can then release you on bail. So that time period was about 10 days average, from when you got arrested to when you actually were brought charges against you, which seems like 10 days is not that long, but that's 10 days that you as a person that was arrested were out of work, which for a lot of people in that county was a really big problem. They would lose their jobs, and so just put them in an even worse spot. But it's also very, very expensive. Those jails are not cheap to run, although I think they're outsourcing them now in Texas. But it's very expensive to house those. And we, with a digital system, were able to reduce that from 10 days to about 36 hours, because they weren't running around trying to find physical files. So when we have these two kind of very different experiences, that means that I can't build a single system that is going to represent those same business processes and workflows for both of those different kinds of experiences. In the first system we built a single business process for everyone. And the people we built it for, Tarrant County, people on the left, they loved it. Everyone else hated it because it didn't represent their actual business process. So we had a few options. We could buy a workflow system, or we could build a very lightweight one ourselves. And that's what we wound up doing, is just trying to find what is the smallest thing we can build that could capture a workflow that you have. You can make it configurable and then build a system around that. Not make the infinitely configurable system, because that's always going to be a problem. Spending all your time configuring it versus actually trying to use it. And so we just built something very small and simple. Yes, it's a state machine. You have a previous and a next state. You could have different roles performing those transitions. You could have different actions you can do based on those transitions. Just the very bare minimum. And in fact, when we started this, we only started with basically the two things on the left, a status and a transition. And only after we proved we needed more did we start to build on top of this model. We at all times tried to resist prematurely building into this model of different behaviors until we had an actual use case from a real county that needed it. So that meant that we can drive our work via queues. So individual counties can configure queues of work for cases with different statuses or different flags so that they could build workflows for themselves and not have us build those workflows into the individual systems. Now, I will have one side warning on here. Be very wary of the product owner that loves Jira because they will want to build Jira. So this is another resistance we had. Like, can't you just make it like Jira? And like, can't you just? Like, that's a trigger warning for me now. So this was a system where we wanted to pare back as much as possible to say, right, I know you got all the flexibility, but Jira took forever to build by a lot of people, and it's a product you buy. So let's just build the bare minimum that can get you what you need and build on it from there. So that was our third lesson. We had our model of cases, and that made a lot of sense. But when we looked at something like workflow, that was something that we had to take a step back and look at the overall process of the organization and how everything flowed together. So we had to actually build a model one step up from the kind of main aggregates and entities in the system, and that happens a lot for me these days, is building a model kind of one conceptual step up from what's actually going on, but underneath the covers. So our next lesson has to deal with those the layered insanity we had before. So we knew that like all those layers and all that structure, everything as a controller with a service and repository wasn't going to work for us, but we didn't really know what to do next. This was before CQRS, so we didn't really know, we didn't have any guidance about what was the, at least from the DDD community, what was the next right thing to do, to just blindly follow. So we had to figure it out ourselves. And the way we did this was defactor. Has anyone here ever defactored something? It's my favorite thing to do, which is remove all of the patterns that you put in place and go back to the dumbest, most procedural code possible. That way you can start over from like a fresh look and say, okay, based on removing all of the cruft, what is it actually doing? Take a fresh look and say, okay, what are the patterns I need to apply here? So that's what the very first thing we did was on day one of the project, and I was a tech lead in this project, was, okay, I'm not going to put a single pattern in place until the code tells me it needs it. So that means I'm not going to put a repository in until the code tells me I need it, or the tests. I'm not going to put any services in there until the code tells me. What else? Aggregates, value object. I'm going to let the code tell me what it needs to do, and then I'll refactor into that, because those old Fowler books, like those are actually the most valuable books I have as a software developer, is how to take code from point A to point B, but not prematurely pointing at point B, letting point A tell me where it needs to go, and then using just standard refactoring techniques to get it there. So that's what we did. We just defactored it all and said, right, we're not going to put any of those patterns in place until we prove we need it. So we looked at our app and said, okay, after about 2 or 3 months, we took a step back and said, okay, what have we got so far? Well, we've got an application that is basically, we can put into 2 buckets. It has some actions that get data, and there's some actions that change data, and that's it. It was a web app, get and post, that's all we had. Gets are safe idempotent, so I can call gets a lot. And they should have the same result, or at least they shouldn't change anything behind the scenes. And posts are unsafe and not idempotent in terms of HTTP. And so basically, gets represent queries, and posts represent commands. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. And so we started modeling all of our system around these concepts of queries and commands. We didn't call them that at the time. It took us a while to settle on the terms queries and commands because this was before CQRS. And so we called them, I think, requests and queries at the time. But it was basically that. I have some kind of input, then something that handles that request, and then there's some kind of output. Even for commands, there's some kind of output of like success or failure, valid or invalid, or good or nothing. But no matter what, our entire system was just a series of inputs to some kind of request handler to an output. So I wound up actually building an open source library around this because it's something we kept seeing it over and over again. So we model each of these concepts as request objects that would get routed to individual handler objects. And it was a very simple input instead of output. This meant that our controllers, the things that mediated the very outer edges of the request, turned out to be very, very thin. Before, our controllers would have like I don't know, 20 different services as part of it, and then only one service would get called for every single controller action. In this case, I saw our controllers as merely a definition of routes in my system and definition of requests. And then I would actually mediate those requests to the actual handlers doing the work. Now the handlers doing the work, this is where I just told our developers, just the first pass in the handler, which is strictly an input and an output. Right here, I have a single input and a single output. Put the most dumbest procedural code you could possibly have in there, and then you can refactor it. But don't do that refactoring until you put the most dumbest code possible. Also, don't do any abstractions in there. So don't put any kind of abstraction layers around anything you use. Just use the thing directly. So if you're using an ORM, just use the ORM directly. And don't worry about trying to abstract those pieces out, because if we need that abstraction, then we'll go ahead and put that in later. But wait until the need proves itself, and then we go from there. And about 4 years in, they still have not needed those abstractions. They've gone along just fine. So I think I was successful in that area. We'd also organize our application by feature, as opposed to by thing, by structural thing. So then I have a folder with all the different kind of top-level features you can do in the system. These more or less represented aggregates in our application, because the aggregate wasn't a class of a thing you could reason about. It instead was a set of things that dealt with a certain concept. And so these represented those kind of top-level concepts and things you could do in our system. And then inside of there, we put literally everything related to that action that you could do as part of that. So any kind of validators, any kind of queries, any kind of commands and command handlers, DTO definitions, message definitions, even the views themselves, we put alongside everything else. And JavaScript as well. We load those JavaScripts up. At that point, I think it was AMD or something like that. It was before all the fancy JavaScript stuff you have now. But we'd have individual files for individual sets of those things and put them all together so that when a developer coming in to reason about a certain request in the application, everything that dealt with that request was physically right next to each other. But not in the same file. That's one step too far. So that was our fourth lesson, which was don't blindly follow pattern advice. Wait until the need presents itself, and then put it in there. But I will say that CQRS is really awesome. I almost always do that as part of my applications, because that's such a fundamental concept of requests, of getting data and changing data, that it makes sense to kind of center around that. Final lesson, dealing with others. And I think we're just about at time, right? Yes, almost. Dealing with others, I built this wall. We paid for it, turns out. So we looked at all the different people that were going to be using the system. So the law enforcement agency looked at them and said, okay, right, how do you actually do this today? They physically walked in and dropped those one of the triplicate forms on the desk and walked away. So that was their interface with the prosecution department today. So what we did was we built them a system to do exactly that. We built them a nice portal that was not connected to anything else, that was basically the effect of them dropping that document on the desk, except it was a portal for them to type it in, and we would validate it, just like you have everything filled out, and they would go on with their day. That portal was a separate, little thin separate application that had its own model, its own set of validations. But the nice thing is we were able to build the model around that separate from everything else, so we could build a very dumb CRUD application for that and not bring in all the other DDD cruft. It was just the dumbest thing that could possibly work. Defense attorneys were a little bit different, because defense attorneys could work on multiple cases in multiple different counties. So we couldn't just have a single system inside the prosecution department. So we had to build a completely separate portal application that talked to a REST API, fielding REST, not everyone else REST. So we were using hypermedia and all that junk, because that defense API could be deployed potentially years apart. So we used REST as a means to be able to evolve that API over time and not break our portals or version anything. And so every single new application that came on the system, we did exactly this. Determine what was the best way for us to interact with our core system and build integration points tailored to the specific needs. And not try to build some sort of generic API, like right-click database, expose REST endpoints, that would not actually solve the needs of anyone. So that was our fifth lesson. The microservices and anti-corruption layers are your friend, and you should do them. So final tally, still a fairly large application, but slightly down from the other one. So we had 70 controllers versus close to 200. Because we were able to build much more granular actions for the users, that's why we had a lot more controllers than I thought of. So we had a lot of actions because we're able to build very granular tasks for the users to do. We also got rid of value objects because there's no such thing as value objects in SQL databases. So don't use things that aren't supported by your database. And at this point, we had about 30 counties deployed. So both successful projects. This one, everyone felt much better at the end, though. So where did I get to the end here? Everyone's seen this picture, right? There's like JavaScript, the definitive guide, and then the good parts is like that big. So I had the same thing with domain-driven design. There's a lot of good stuff in the DDD book, but if I was to take all the good parts and distill them down to one book I would hand to my developers, that'd actually be the Building Microservices book by Sam Newman. That has really all the things I cared about from the domain-driven design book, which is basically this section right here, this taken out and just like put in its own little book over there. So that was the DDD do-over. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of the conference.